a podcast about amazing people from an incredible state. Join Mike Broomhead for Amazing Arizonans, presented by Resolution Copper. Copper is essential to Arizona's economy and to America's future. Learn more at resolutioncopper.com.
Another episode of Amazing Arizonans where we are just seeking out great stories here in Arizona. Sometimes political, usually not. This one isn't. Supreme Court Justice Clint Bolick. I'm so excited about this.
Mike, I have to say that when I look at your past guests, if you do a reunion, I'm happy to be a bartender for them. I am honored to be here.
But you should be here, and there's so many reasons why. And what I love about this is when you're doing your job on the Supreme Court, usually no one knows who you are. It's kind of like being an umpire at a baseball game.
Yes.
And I just think there's so much to learn. And I want to start with something I've said on the air years ago, and I don't know if you've heard me say this. For the people that don't know, your time at the Goldwater Institute. And I love to debate. I love debates. I love conversations. And I said on the air a number of times, we didn't often disagree on things. But when we did, it terrified me to argue with you. I did not want to debate you on an issue because of how, even when we disagreed, how solid you are on your point of view. I mean, obviously you're a lawyer and you are a Supreme Court justice, but that used to be, man, if I'm disagreeing with Clint Bolick and now I'm going to have to argue with him about, I'm in trouble. And so I'm glad those segments were short on the radio.
Well, I appreciate that. And I appreciate the light you bring to so many issues. So that's not always the case or even often the case these days.
So let's talk. I'd like to get a little background because I'm always intrigued how someone ends up where they are and if they imagined that they would. What made you interested in the law so much so that you dedicated your life to it?
So this was a very late decision for me. I didn't even think about being a lawyer until the senior year of college.
Oh, wow.
My dad was a welder with an 8th grade education. I was among the first in my family to graduate from college. And, my dad...
Where'd you go to school?
So I went to Drew University, which is a small liberal arts school in New Jersey.
Okay.
And then I am bi-coastal. I went to UC Davis for law school.
Yeah.
But two things happened that really set me in this direction. One was that I had planned to be a school teacher, and I have a lifetime certification to teach history in my home state of New Jersey. And I interned and student taught, and I thought to myself, this is a disaster. This is not a one student at a time solution. This requires systemic change that I just can't do as a teacher. The other was taking a class in constitutional law, and the light bulbs just went off. I am a black and white person. I don't like to compromise all the time, although I do from time to time. But in law, you win or you lose, and you can maintain your principles throughout. And when I saw cases like Brown versus Board of Education that literally changed the world by adhering to the principles in our great Constitution, I'm like, I want to become a constitutional lawyer. Fortunately, I had no mentors. I did not know any lawyers. And so I had no one who told me, almost no one gets to be a constitutional lawyer. So with that blissful ignorance, I went off to law school, and it's just been fantastic.
I can hear the passion in your voice, and it doesn't matter what the subject is. When you find something that you're passionate about, it never feels like work. I would imagine there's been some really difficult days, but if you're passionate about it, what was your first job as a lawyer? What was the first thing you did?
So I really wanted to practice constitutional law, and I discovered that there at the time were a handful of fledgling right-of-center public interest law firms. One of them was Pacific Legal Foundation, which is now a mega organization that was right next door in Sacramento, and I interned there for the summer. But then my first job was at Mountain States Legal Foundation in Denver, and that's really where I got my start. I was there for a few years. I took on affirmative action issues, got my first case up to the U.S. Supreme Court within a couple of years, and then I joined the Reagan administration, after that, co-founded the Institute for Justice.
What was it like walking into the Reagan administration? What year did you join the Reagan administration?
So I joined late. I did not join until 1985, so it was already halfway done. But one of the cool things about joining an administration when your team is in power is that as a young lawyer or even as a non-lawyer, you get responsibilities handed to you that because they trust you, they know that you are going to advance their agenda. So within a few months, I was arguing in the Second Circuit against a former Solicitor General of the United States. I had no business doing this, Mike. So it was really, really heady stuff. The other thing is and that was at the Justice Department. Before I joined the Justice Department, I was at the EEOC for a year, and choose your mentors carefully. I bonded with the chairman of the EEOC, and he went on to become a U.S. Supreme Court justice. His name is Clarence Thomas. So I was I had so much luck in my career as well as opportunities.
Well, they always say that's where good luck, where you meet hard work with opportunity, and you create your own luck. When you look at some of the things that you did at the beginning of your career that led you, the Institute for Justice and the Goldwater Institute, when I look at, let's talk about two organizations. When you look at the Goldwater Institute and you look at the ACLU, both would say, and I would believe them, that their passion is adherence to the Constitution. Mm-hmm. How can somebody be as passionate about that document and yet have such polarizing views in opposition on the issues?
Well, that's a really good question. And there are times both at the Institute for Justice and at the Goldwater Institute when we partnered with the ACLU, especially on free speech issues.
Right.
But I would say that, it all comes down to constitutional philosophy. Their constitutional philosophy is that the Constitution is an evolving document. They call it living constitutionalism. Mm-hmm. And it substantively changes with the times. I think it's a living document too, in that it established principles for all time that can only be changed through very difficult processes. And I am a textualist, so just those two very different views of how the law should be decided leads you to different positions. But I have great respect for the ACLU, and they've made some precedents that have benefited us all.
And I don't want to be specific about things, but I am when you look at the First Amendment, you talk about First Amendment issues. The founding fathers would have had no idea that we would have smartphones and we would have the access to information and the ability to share information like we do now. But the First Amendment principles on free speech, just free speech, seem to be timeless, and it doesn't matter what the vehicle is. But then when you look at the same people that would argue that with you when it comes to the Second Amendment, would make an argument that the founding fathers had no idea where we would be in our access to weaponry and things of that nature. But I think, again, I'm such a novice, but the principle is the same, that the same timelessness in the First Amendment applies to the Second Amendment as well.
Oh, of course it does. And, just as I think liberals and conservatives alike would argue that you're applying the basic principles of the First Amendment to the technology of the 21st century. Same would be true of the Second Amendment. And that's, of course, where the U.S. Supreme Court has gone on the issue.
And I'm not asking the question or bringing this up to you to start a debate on the Second Amendment. This is more about policy and principle. It's that if one applies, then it applies across the board.
Yes.
And that, in my mind, I had an interesting conversation in this room with John Kyle. And John Kyle,
one of my heroes,
mine too,
and one of my mentors also.
Oh, really?
Yes,
he's such a great guy and such a good man. And we had the conversation once. I interviewed him years ago when he was on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and his name had been mentioned as a Supreme Court justice.
Yeah, I was one of the ones mentioning it until he called me personally and told me to cut it out, Clint.
Well, he answered when I asked him about that. He said, no way. And I asked him why. And his answer, I don't know what he said to you, but at the time what he said to me was he had spent his entire career making policy. And to take off his policy hat and to try to judge a law based on constitutionality, he didn't know if he'd be able to not blur that line with his policy mind.
Yeah. And, if that was his reason, he was wrong about that. He would have been masterful about it.
I absolutely agree.
So I had to do the exact same thing, going from public interest law to being a judge. And one of the things you do as a public interest lawyer is to size up your own case. If you're not good at that, then you're not going to be a very successful lawyer. And then once you decide you have a worthwhile case, a viable case, then you start advocating. A judge just takes that first step and sizes it up. And I've found that in many instances, I have ruled against policy positions that I favor. And it was Neil Gorsuch. My wife, Shauna, was watching his confirmation hearings, and he said something along the lines of a judge who doesn't disagree with some of his decisions is not a good judge. And she said, he sounds just like you. And Kyle would have been fantastic at that.
But isn't it knowing your role? And it's not just in the law. I've said this about whether it's somebody that is the leader of a political party or any organization. You have a responsibility. If you want to be an activist, I respect activism a great deal.
Yes.
But if you are taking on a position, sometimes you have to take your activism out of it. That's the responsibility of the job. If you want to be an activist, go be an activist, and we respect it. But that role requires you to not be an activist. And many people, Eric Holder said he didn't. He said, I want to be remembered. I don't mind being remembered as an activist attorney general. It wouldn't matter to me which party said that. That to me was scary.
Yes. I agree with that. Having worked at the Justice Department, there are many instances where the first thing you have to do is to say, do we have the legal authority to do this? And I think we've really, administration by administration, gotten removed from that. Holder, I think was a prime example of that. And I have to say, in his instance, it's a tad personal. He came here to Arizona to campaign against my retention last year.
Okay.
So he's still an activist. But when you say things like that, I think it lessens the public's respect for the rule of law. The Attorney General is different. I think most presidents can be, you give the benefit of the doubt to their nominees for cabinet positions because they are policy positions.
Right.
But the Attorney General is the principal law enforcer of the country. He takes, they all do, we all do, an oath to the Constitution. And I think our best attorneys general have been those that take that oath seriously and recognize that is their first responsibility.
And what has to be difficult for them, whether it's our attorney general here in the state of Arizona or it's at the federal level, that you are put into that position by the political party that you're affiliated with. You've spent years probably working on campaigns or running for office. You may have run for office. So there is a political slant. But if you're doing your job well, like you said, you're going to have people that you care deeply about that are going to disagree with your decisions.
Absolutely.
That's got to be difficult to do.
Yes. No, of course it is. And, without getting into details, I've been chastised by people who think that I am there on the U.S. Oh my God. I almost promoted myself. The state Supreme Court and not doing their policy bidding or their political bidding. And it's really disappointing because I know they know better. And if they supported my nomination to the court, they knew what kind of judge I was going to be. I announced I am a textualist. I really mean this stuff.
When you look at, and I don't want to jump too far ahead because I end up with these conversations, I'm all over the place. I'm trying to stay in some order. I want to talk about Goldwater because you mentioned mentors that you had. One of the things I respected so much and I loved about your time at Goldwater, and they've carried on famously, I think they're doing a great job, is I was asked a couple of times to come and speak to the interns. They had things called Lunch and Learn.
Yes.
And I would go and speak with these young people. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but it was the conversation, I think, more about communication than anything. But to sit around a lunch table with a bunch of young people that have the same passion that you have, but are just starting in their careers. Yes. How important is it to you to be a mentor?
So there is nothing more important than that, in my view. I am fortunate enough to be able to teach constitutional law at ASU Law School every fall. I love it. I have as many clerks and interns as I possibly can. And every student or young person who writes me and asks for career advice, I always spend time with them. That's your legacy. I'm proud to say that, were there to be a U.S. Supreme Court vacancy, two of the people on the short list were former not judicial law clerks, but IJ, Institute for Justice clerks of mine. Wow. Naomi Rao on the D.C. Circuit and Jim Ho on the Fifth Circuit. And, that's where you have an eternal impact. And one of my mentors taught me, Milton Friedman, who I absolutely worshipped, he never used email in his entire life, but everyone who wrote him a letter, he wrote back. And I, even today, will encounter people who will say, "You're not going to believe this. I wrote Milton Friedman a letter and I finished their sentence for them, and he wrote you back." If he could do it, we all can do it.
It's funny you say that. Along those lines, when I was very new in radio, just a couple of years in, I had the privilege of being asked by Glenn Beck's people to fill in for him. And I ended up becoming the regular.
How intimidating is that?
At the very beginning, it was a nightmare. I just was. First of all, I thought it was a joke. I got an email. I was home visiting my family in Florida. I was in the car. My mother was driving, and I was checking emails because I had just gotten off an airplane. And I got an email from an AOL email address. And I thought, all right, this is shady. And the guy asked me about my interest in filling in for Glenn. And I just said, yeah, sure, just because I thought it was fake. Mm-hmm. Turned out to be real. But when I finally met Glenn face to face, he said, "How are you doing? I'm hearing good things." And I foolishly was honest. And I said, "I am in so far over my head. My career is moving much faster than my ability."
Oh.
And he was so kind to me. He invited me to Dallas to shadow his team. Now, Glenn and I are completely different in style and in a lot of things, but he was so good to me. I traveled with him on a weekend to Washington, D.C., and he had an event in the morning at the Capitol, and we were at the World War II Memorial with honor flights, and he shook hands with every person. He signed every autograph. We didn't sleep we left Phoenix on Friday night. We landed on Saturday morning. We went straight to the Capitol. He was as gracious to everyone around him. And I knew my career would never be as big as his. But I looked at what he did and I thought, if that guy will do that for every person, I'll never complain about my schedule again. And it was one of the greatest life lessons I ever learned.
Oh, that is fantastic. And, everyone has an opportunity to be a mentor. And it's so gratifying when you see people going places that you just had a smidgen of impact on. So I really encourage everyone to seize that opportunity.
When you look at what Institute for Justice, you look at what Goldwater has accomplished. Talk about that legacy. Do you mind when you look at those two organizations?
Not at all. I was just thinking the other day at the Institute for Justice, it took us 2.5 years to win our first case. We had a donor who meant to compliment us, but it was so painful what he said. He said, "This is the best law firm that has never won a case." And now there's not a year that goes by when IJ does not win a case in the U.S. Supreme Court.
Right.
We started with 7. I think they're up to 175 people with offices around the country. Goldwater started the center rights efforts to vindicate state constitutions. And there's now over a dozen organizations around the country who are doing what Goldwater started out to do, which was to vindicate the guarantees in state constitutions, which often go far beyond the guarantees of individual liberty that are in the federal Constitution. In fact, our gun rights provision in Article 2, Section 26 of our state constitution is far more explicit than the Second Amendment. So seeing the impact of both of those organizations is incredibly gratifying.
And the mentor angle we were just talking about, how fascinating that you were in the Reagan administration, and it's pretty well known that Reagan has said there would never have been a Ronald Reagan if there hadn't been a Barry Goldwater.
Yes.
And that he gave him credit for so much. And the speech that I'm sure you heard, but I've listened to even the years later, A Time for Choosing, that Reagan gave that amazing speech to raise money for Goldwater. And it was kind of that, and I'm just imagining, because I'm a little bit younger than you. I was 18 years old in 1985. I was just 6 months too young to vote for Reagan the second time. But I remember listening to that speech by Ronald Reagan and imagining that there were people that were hearing that for the first time thinking, man, who is this guy?
Yes.
And never imagining that 20 years later, what his career would be like.
Well, and he could have destroyed his career by giving that speech. Goldwater goes down in one of the biggest electoral debacles in history.
Yeah.
That could have been it for Ronald Reagan in politics.
Yep.
But instead, people saw this principled man who always stayed true to his principles.
But the eloquence, that was, they called him the great communicator years later.
Yes.
But even then, the eloquence of being able to convey a concise point, to move people with your words. There's people that can speak well, and there are people that can move people with their words. Martin Luther King Jr.
Yes.
Even Barack Obama, the hope and change, what he talked about, you could see people moved by his words.
Oh, absolutely.
Different, I think, in legacy with people, but Reagan was someone that was always able to move people with his words.
Yes. And, I look forward to the day when we have more such eloquent people who articulate to the core of their being the freedom philosophy.
So when you look at the accomplishments, can you give me, let's talk about Goldwater for a moment. I remember one of our conversations. I'm gonna confess something to you. One of our conversations we had a disagreement about was about the Coyotes at the time in the arena, and I knew we disagreed about it.
There were a lot of people we disagreed.
I know.
with.
And you came on and we talked about it on the air, and it was a good spirited. It was a fun conversation. And I had a pickup truck. I always do, but I had a pickup truck at the time, and I had the Coyotes logo on the center of the window, the back window of my vehicle, a big decal, like this big. And I pulled up to one of the lunch and learns, and I strategically parked by the Goldwater sign. So then I took a picture from the back of my truck. There's the Coyotes logo, and there it says Goldwater Institute on the wall. But I remember that conversation with you, and it was, again, about principle. And I thought, it's an amazing conversation because it doesn't matter what the subject is. It fits or it doesn't. Mm-hmm. And I think it is at the core, isn't it that simple?
Yeah, it really is. And that is one of the things, not specifically the Coyotes, but the gift clause of the Arizona Constitution was at the core of that.
Yep.
And that, constitutional clauses have no meaning whatsoever if no one vindicates them. And this was a provision. It prohibits gifts of public funds to private entities. It was sitting around our Constitution since 1912, and really no one had forcefully used it. We first used it to challenge a nearly $100 million subsidy to a Chicago developer to develop the City North
I remember
shopping
that.
center.
The shopping center and the parking, right?
Yes.
I remember that.
And we won.
People were mad.
People were very, very upset.
I remember
about that.
thinking about that principle, and I thought, well, that's what the law says. I didn't like it necessarily because we all wanted to see the massive growth and expansion.
Yes.
But the principle was it violates the law.
Yes. And if only, it's one of the provisions in the state constitution that I call are if only provisions. If only the federal constitution had a gift clause in it, But we are lucky to have the framers having said, wow, these railroad subsidies don't work. We keep giving money to railroads, they go belly up, and nothing happens. So we're going to prohibit that. So it's one of the core guarantees in our Constitution. And as a justice, I've had an opportunity also to write an opinion in that area, a unanimous one joined by all my colleagues. And, anytime we have an opportunity to give the original intended meaning to a state constitutional provision, it's a really good day.
But I've also I've talked about this, about the U.S. Supreme Court, in that whatever the case is that's been decided, for the people involved, it's important to them. But the implications of the ripple effect across the country is the big thing. And I would imagine it's got to be the same at the state Supreme Court. When you make a decision, it has implications for the case specifically you've decided, but it will now be referenced in cases. It's now set a precedent, and that's a huge responsibility.
Well, and a huge opportunity as well. A lot of state constitutions have provisions in common with each other. So yes, we do look to the precedents of other states, and other states look to our precedents as well. In fact, on the gift clause, the Texas Supreme Court recently wrestled with its gift clause and referenced the Arizona decisions on that provision. And some of these provisions, the ones that are unique to state constitutions, the U.S. Supreme Court has nothing to say about them. They give us no guidance whatsoever. And so we do have to be very careful about the precedents that we set and look to precedents in other states as well.
Before we move on to something else, I want to go back for a moment. You mentioned at the beginning of this that your father was a welder. So you came from a working class family like I did. I was raised by a single mom. Did you ever imagine in your wildest dreams, even when you decided you wanted to be a constitutional lawyer, that you'd be sitting here or sitting on that bench as a state Supreme Court justice?
No. And then also, when becoming a public interest lawyer, if you're a good public interest lawyer, you piss a lot of people off.
Yeah.
Like the Coyotes. John McCain took to center ice at the Coyotes arena to lambaste the Goldwater Institute.
But he liked the organization.
Yes.
But that issue.
Yes. So you pretty much have to say, I'm never going to be a judge. if you're a good public interest lawyer. In fact, the only two I can think of who served on a prominent court were Thurgood Marshall and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and that's the only time I put myself in their company.
Yeah.
It's just very, very atypical. And so even as a lawyer, I did not give a second thought to it. And it wasn't until Governor Ducey was elected and someone said, Clint, you ought to apply for the Arizona Supreme Court. We have a merit selection system. Maybe Governor Ducey would give you consideration. I thought, you know what? That could be a lot of fun.
Has it been?
Oh my God. Apart from the retention election, it has been a real blast. My colleagues are amazing. It is a very collegial court. That is not true. It wasn't even true of the Arizona Supreme Court in the 1990s. It was a very toxic environment. But even when we disagree, I often compare my job to my wife's job as a state legislator.
Yeah.
I have never, and I'm now in my 10th year on the court, I have never exchanged a crossword with one of my colleagues, no matter how strongly we disagreed. Poor Shauna has never had a day where she hasn't exchanged a crossword with a colleague, and even, in her own party. And, it suits me dispositionally, just as you were describing our discussions before, to have disagreements in a civil manner.
But even to have them be fun.
Yes, that's right.
I would say I was arguing with you and I'm debating with you. I felt like I'm the sparring partner for a champion that's getting ready for a big fight. What I meant was I knew you were going to make me better because of your grasp of things. And I also knew I would second guess my position in a respectful way if I disagreed with you and Goldwater. That I was I so respected the organization that even if I thought, no, on this I disagree, but maybe I'm wrong here because you guys were right so often.
Well, and that's an institutional dynamic at the court. When we disagree with each other, we exchange drafts of our opinions, and they say iron sharpens iron. In a case in which we have a dissenting opinion, I can guarantee you the majority opinion is better than it would have been without the dissenting opinion. And that sort of good faith exchange where you're not tossing ad hominem attacks at your colleagues. Right. You are challenging their thinking. And when you do that, just like when you go to the gym and use weight equipment, you're growing your muscles.
Do you have an opinion on how we've gotten to where we are? Is it a lack of education of the separation of powers? Is it a lack of basic knowledge of the Constitution where people expect you to legislate based on their feelings about something versus this is what it says, this is why we've decided this way? So
you mean from the court's perspective?
Well, so don't you think, though, I'm sorry to interrupt, but
no, not at all.
We're watching in society now, Justice Roberts at the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Roberts, made a decision where he sided with what was considered the liberals on the court on an aspect of Obamacare.
Yes.
And I'm paraphrasing what he said in his opinion. But he basically said, it's not my job to decide if the law is good or bad. If you don't like bad laws, stop electing bad lawmakers. Mm-hmm. And I thought, that's a guy that made a lot of people angry. But what he said was, my job is to look at this and figure out if it fits within the four corners of the Constitution. And that's what I did.
Well, two responses to that. First of all, we are in these bubbles now where people listen, they get all of their news from a single source. And courts, unfortunately, now are being characterized as political institutions. And even during my retention campaign, we came out with a couple of decisions that upset conservatives. Well, it wasn't, the headlines were not court makes erroneous decision. It's corrupt court does X. It ignores, all of the evidence, which is simply preposterous. And yet this is where people are getting their information, and it is very difficult for judges who speak through their decisions to counter that. The other side is on the legislation. Scalia, who as a judge, he has become my favorite justice because he was the greatest at the science of judging. And Scalia said, sometimes the legislature, the Congress sends us garbage. Yeah. It's intentionally garbage because it's a compromise, but it's just really bad, legislation. And he says, every instinct in our body is to fix it. But our job is to send the garbage back. And then he said, garbage in, garbage out. The legislature, which also has a constitutional oath, if it sends us an unconstitutional law, it is our obligation to strike it down. But if we're just interpreting it, it is our obligation to give, in my view, effect to the words they chose to enact. Right. And if they don't like it, to get back to your original point, they should fix it.
And isn't it fascinating that no matter what you're reading, if it's a judge, a federal court judge that's made a decision on something, if it's a Supreme Court judge in the state of Arizona that makes a decision, it seems as if now it's become requirement to tell you who appointed that judge.
Yes.
And it either affirms their position that, okay, this was a Republican piece of legislation, but that was a Trump appointee that said it was bad, so it must be okay.
Yeah.
Or it's a Republican, and it happens on both sides.
Oh, absolutely.
Where they say, this was an Obama appointee that said this. And they do the same thing. A Ducey appointee said this. And it's almost the politics somehow gets jammed in there as if this was a political decision.
Yeah. And it happens locally all the time. The more left of center columnists simply refer to us as the Ducey court, as if we are this monolithic body. Holy cow, do we disagree with each other? And I think you could find a case that represents every possible split among, our justices. And it is simply not a partisan court. And some of my conservative friends will speculate, what goes on behind closed doors. Oh, are they afraid to overturn that election and all of that? And I sometimes laugh out loud because those conversations never take place.
Yeah.
It is all, we begin after the case is over with the most senior justice, who is not the Chief Justice, with his legal analysis, and we go down the line, and it is pure law.
I have gotten myself in trouble with, and I'm going to wade into something here and see how far you're going to wade in with me. I've gotten myself in trouble. I'm free to say I don't have to worry about any political leaning. I mean, I said I am unapologetically pro-life, have been my whole life. And when Arizona was debating the issue you had to decide on at the Supreme Court, on whether or not we were going to default back to what was written originally as a territorial law, I went on the air and I said, just from a public relations standpoint, as a pro-life person, I've been arguing for years that medical advancements are different now than when Roe was enacted, and that pregnancies are much safer for the mother. Pregnancies become viable much sooner.
Yes.
So laws should reflect the medical advancements and when pregnancies are viable in the minds of people. And if we're, as pro-life people, going to make that argument, which we've been making for years, it is bad public image to say we want to see Arizona default back to a law that goes back to territorial days. And I found myself in trouble with people because I had that opinion. Mm-hmm. It had no relevance on what the decision was going to be. That was just my opinion. Mm-hmm. you had to go into a room and you had to make a decision on what the law said. You made a decision. Did you know going into making that decision that it was going to threaten your time on the court?
So, first of all, from your perspective echoes my wife's, who is also very, very pro-life, and yet risked her political career.
She did.
By moving to repeal our decision. And by the way, we're 1-1. I have overturned a bill that she supported, and she has overturned one of my decisions. So
how does that go over at dinner?
Oh, it actually we respect and understand each other's roles so well.
See, I'm so sorry to hear that. I wanted to hear that no one spoke for a day or two.
If we have time, I will give you a funny story about that, though. But we did go into that room knowing that there would be major political fallout. We knew that the two justices who were going to be on the ballot this year would be targets. You just have to go. If you take your oath to the Constitution, which includes interpreting the laws as they're written, seriously, there's simply, no doubt as to how you have to come out. Have there been judges in our nation's history who have gotten weak knees? Absolutely, there have been. But
human nature.
Yes. But in this instance, I hesitate to say that it was clear because we had two dissenting votes. But
are you allowed to talk about what in your mind was the deciding factor? Can you talk about it?
So yes, more than anything else, and by the way, that decision, recognizing that it was going to be a very controversial decision. My colleague, John Lopez, who is now Vice Chief Justice, wrote it so carefully so that people could really read that and understand it. Very few people read that decision. And Justice Timmer, who wrote the dissent, went out of her way, and I am so grateful for this, and she's now Chief Justice, to say this is not a political decision on either side. The justices simply disagree on their legal interpretation, and that was 100% correct. But to us, in the majority, at least for me, the major decisive factor was the sequence of events that occurred. After Roe versus Wade comes down and our law is struck down, our recalcitrant legislature reenacts the law that has been struck down. And then in subsequent legislative enactments, they're constantly referring back to, including the most recent, I think it was 9-week prohibition. Yeah. It says expressly nothing in this law affects that territorial law. And when you are getting this isn't just opinions expressed by individual legislators. This is in the law.
Yeah, it's written.
Yes. And so that sequencing where the legislature seemed to make clear over and over again that if that law ever had a chance to go back into effect, that was what was intended, more than anything else really cemented at least my decision on that.
When you look at something like that, is there, and maybe this is common for you, it would seem to me there's many times you can appreciate someone's motive, but you have to disagree with what they've done.
Right.
And, you can understand my perspective. As somebody that's pro-life, I can completely respect you wanting to protect life, that your goal is that. But I think it was a major mistake in what happened. That's just my personal opinion. And, knowing that in my silly world where I'd go on the air and say something, that there were going to be people that I'm normally standing shoulder to shoulder with angry with me on social media,
and
which isn't a real place.
Angry, right?
But it's not a real place. It's social media.
Right.
The implications of your decision were going to affect the lives of people. And yours was a decision that mattered.
Yeah.
Mine was an opinion that was expressed on the radio. And the gravity of that had to be overwhelming.
Yes. And, certainly we knew that there was a chance that the legislature itself would overturn it. Also, waiting in the wings was a constitutional challenge to this law, which, in hindsight, now that the law is gone, could have very well gone the other way.
Yeah.
So it could have had a huge impact on people's lives, but there were exit routes that could be taken.
When you look at what happened, and then the challenge that your wife's career, as far as the legislature, was now up in the air and being challenged very. A hard challenge. I live in that district, so I know the political breakdown, and I understand the challenges, and we've all seen the videos of how the meetings went at times. And but then for you and your time on the court and the challenge to your time on the court, did you, when it came out that your wife won her election and that it seemed to be by, standards of elections, it was pretty easily on your side that you won this, was there a sense of vindication?
It was really appreciation for the discernment of the voters. Now, one of the things that made me pessimistic about my retention chances was that I knew the abortion referendum was, or initiative was going to pass. We all did. And so a huge percentage of the people who would vote for that would also have to vote for my retention. And the fact that they did was, in my view, a vote not for Clint Bolick, but a vote for the independence of the judiciary, which is far more important than me. And the vote ended up being so decisive, as you pointed out, that I am hoping this will never happen again in Arizona.
Yeah.
That judges who get, we have a merit selection system. Part of that system is we get rated by everyone who appears before us.
Right.
How many institutions do you have where that is the case? So people who have just lost a case in front of us get to rate us right afterwards. And my colleague Justice King and I had approval ratings from our consumers, so to speak, in the 90s. Judges like that should never lose.
Right.
And yet, if they had succeeded, it would just be. It would become a political contest, just like it is in states like Wisconsin and others, Texas and others.
Did you find it difficult? Do you find it difficult to watch? Like, even now when I'm talking to you, I'm trying not to drag you into an opinion thing that someone's going to watch this and it's going to end up somewhere. Do you find it difficult with all of your years as an opinion giver to moderate what you say so it doesn't compromise a decision you might have to make?
So I have to police myself all the time. And fortunately, in my opinion, there's never been a better time to have to go dark.
Yeah.
Because I would risk so many friendships, if I was free to express myself. But I do have to police myself. And so I have to weigh, is this an issue that could potentially appear before me and that I might appear biased?
Do you feel a sense of responsibility to your colleagues on the court that if you step out of line, so to speak, that now the entire court continues to get questioned?
Oh, absolutely.
The reason why I ask is the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She was very vocal.
Yes.
To the point where Justice Roberts had to ask her to kind of quell her personal opinions.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't matter what side of the political aisle she was on. I always thought there is this argument about liberal justices and conservative justices, and now it's a conservative court. It was a liberal court, and they've been fighting that forever. No matter what they decide, half the country thinks they're wrong. And when you step out with your political opinions like that, as boldly as she did, all of your colleagues now have to answer for their politics.
That's right. And, the rule of law and the integrity of the court system is so important to this country. Our independent judiciary, one of the great gifts of our framers, one of the great, moments of brilliance of our framers, is constantly in jeopardy. And if we are seen as a political institution, it's game over.
Do you believe most justices, most judges are impartial?
Yes.
Do you think that when there is the exception to the rule, and there is in every business,
exceptions to the
that
rule,
it's glaring because it's rare?
Yes. That is, Mike, that is a great way to put it. And just seeing, Ducey appointed more non-Republican judges than I believe any of his predecessors did. And what he was looking for in judges was judges. Mm-hmm. In previous years, it was a more partisan flavor. Not that the results necessarily were any different, but when I think of the Democrats that he appointed, one of whom is now going to be my colleague on the Arizona Supreme Court, I think, wow, they are really good judges.
She was appointed originally by Ducey.
Yes.
And now Governor Hobbs, a staunch Democrat, appoints her.
Yes.
To the Arizona
and she is a registered Democrat.
Yeah.
And I think she's going to be a great justice. She's a great Court of Appeals judge. And when I think of other Democrats who Ducey appointed, oh my gosh, I would, at Goldwater or elsewhere, I wouldn't have had a moment's hesitation appearing before them. And that's, Arizonans don't know all that much about our merit selection system. Before becoming a judge, I litigated in 16 states across the country, some of whom have partisan elections for judges. They have to ask the people who appear before them for campaign contributions. Not an ideal system. Others have the federal system. And one of the things when Shauna and I moved to Arizona in 2001, being the nerd that I am, I'm like, I've practiced in Arizona. I love the judicial system. No matter who you appear before, that person is honest and is hardworking and smart. And I'm good with that, whether they're a registered Democrat or Republican or independent. And this system is really, really worth preserving. And if nothing else from the retention election, a lot of people found out this year of necessity about how our judges here in Arizona are appointed. And the more they know, in my opinion, the more they like it.
And doesn't it then give peace of mind to anybody on the court, not that you didn't have it before, but an affirmation that you can make decisions based on the interpretation of the law and the Constitution and not fear for your career and retribution politically?
Yes. And that, that works down the line. I was not certain I was going to run for retention. I only have 3 years before facing mandatory retirement, which is, of course, also a difference between our system and the U.S. Supreme Court. I'd be a spring chicken on the U.S. Supreme Court.
You would?
Yeah. So I wasn't sure whether running for retention for only having three years would be worth it. And a number of my friends and my wife said, you have to run, because if you don't run, judges are going to be looking over their shoulders. And we have such a good system that I said, okay, I'm in, and hopefully this will help preserve the system rather than the reverse, and it had a happy ending.
Do you see yourself slowing down when it's time for you to go from the Supreme Court, or do you jump back in with both feet? I mean, Institute for Justice, Goldwater Institute, is there another?
So, I hope so. I will never litigate again. For the lawyers in your audience, I like to say my last discovery motion was my last discovery motion. But I would like to continue contributing. One of the things, and I know you know this too, the older you get, the more experience and wisdom you get, and it's a shame to waste that.
Right.
And so whether it's teaching full time, whether it is returning to the policy arena in some fashion, whether there's some crisis and I serve on some commission, whatever it is, so long as it's a challenge, I would be open for it.
My grandfather used to say, and I'm sure you've heard it, youth is wasted on the young.
Yes.
And so here we are with all this experience, and we say, I wish I knew then.
Yes.
What I know now.
Yes.
And there is that combination of, at least for me, wanting to grab someone younger and say, when someone did this to me, I didn't listen. And I'm telling you, listen.
Yes.
That
yes.
there's something to wanting to pass on what I've learned from making mistakes to help somebody else not make them.
Yes. Well, and I want to return to the anecdote I was going to tell you about Shauna.
Please.
So we discuss her work unless her work may come before me, but we never discuss my work unless it's a decision that's out. And I had a marijuana case very early in my tenure as a judge. And Shauna had very strong opinions on it. And she's like, I know how you're going to rule on it. And I don't like it. And she was really, really angry. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, I'm actually coming out the other way than she thinks I am. And she was actually angry at me for 3 months until the decision finally came out, which I wrote. And she was perfectly happy with it, but did not say, gee, Clint, I'm sorry I've been angry at you for no good reason the last few months. But
and
we do.
Good for you keeping up for 3 months worth of what was going on instead of saying, listen, trust me.
Don't worry about it.
You don't know what I'm going to do here.
No, and she now, occasionally she will, like the bills that we struck down, she did say as soon as she learned what the challenge was, it was Governor Ducey had vetoed a whole bunch of conservative bills because he was angry at the legislature because they hadn't passed a budget. Mm-hmm. And the School Boards Association challenged, so then they repassed the bills as part of the budget.
Right.
And the School Boards Association said there's a single subject provision in our Constitution.
I remember that. This was ASBA.
Yes, exactly. And you can't pass substantive legislation as part of the budget. Again, a provision I wish was in the federal Constitution as well. And Shauna looked at this and she said, I know how you're going to vote on this. And that time she was absolutely right.
So a couple of things before we finish. One of them is I want to ask you about lawyers in general, because we all have lawyer jokes.
Yes, I have my own.
Yeah, the old adage that it's the 99% of lawyers to give the other 1% a bad name, all of that.
Yeah.
So here's the story, and I just want to get your reaction to it. When the Jodi Arias trial was going on, like everybody else, we all paid very close attention. And when Jodi Arias came out with her defense, and it was basically to attack the character of Travis Alexander, and he was looking at child pornography and all of these things that she accused him of to damage his character. Almost, I can't get away, in my opinion, I can't get away from the fact that I did it. So I'm going to go with he deserves it. Like everybody else, and she said, her defense attorney, Kirk Nurmi, I don't know if you know Kirk.
I don't.
was blamed for this heinous defense, that as this poor man's family sat in the courtroom and just watched his killer destroy his character without him being allowed to defend himself. And I did what everybody else did. I went after the defense attorney. And I just thought, what a horrible human being that would do something like that. And I watched a documentary series called In Defense Of. And I don't know if you've seen it or if it even interests you. But what they did was they went back and talked to the defense attorneys that had to defend Ted Bundy, had to defend the Oklahoma City bomber, Timothy McVeigh, and had to defend Jodi Arias. And they talked to them about those cases. And Kirk Nermy sat down and said, I tried to get myself off the case. They made me stay. That was not my defense, but I'm bound by law that if I can't prove she's lying, I have to let her defend herself the way she wants. And she tried to destroy me. She promised to destroy me. And I watched that documentary and I thought, I was so wrong about that man.
Different perspective, yeah.
So I went on the air and I apologized. I sent him a message, and I didn't know him. I sent him a message on X, Twitter then, and I went on the air and I brought him on the air to apologize to him, and we've become friends. And I would imagine that him and I disagree politically. We haven't had many discussions, but I found out what a good person he is. And I thought, I wonder, and this is where I'd like your opinion, I wonder how many of us have this opinion of an ambulance chasing lawyer, defense attorney that was willing to say and do anything to get a client off. How wrong are we?
So there are such people, of course. And the one thing that I really appreciate about the legal profession is that we have ethical guardrails. We are one of the few professions that have it. God, I wish journalists did. And we enforce those guardrails. In fact, the prosecutor in the Arias case,
Juan Martinez, right?
Yes, we sanctioned him heavily for some of the cases, and that opinion was written by my colleague Justice Lopez, who is a former prosecutor, and I find that former prosecutors hold prosecutors to a really high, they hold them to the standards, the applicable standards.
Yeah, I read more about that than most. I know some of the citizens that were involved inappropriately. Let's just say that.
So, and there's definitely that side to it. But by and large, when lawyers step out of line, there are consequences. And I have to say, during my retention election, one of the things that I hated about it was that we were thrust into a world where there are no guardrails. The people who were coming after us had no ethical limits whatsoever in terms of what they could say. And I, as an advocate of free speech, I support their right to say untrue things. But all things being equal, I would say that my respect for the legal profession as a whole, the amount of volunteer time that lawyers do en masse, the fact that that generally they adhere to the rules, and when they don't, there are consequences. It's the worst profession in the world except for all the others.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it, because everybody. The reason why I even told you that story is we have a picture in our mind of certain people, and when that mold is broken, it makes you question what you think about.
Yes.
I don't believe that is. I don't believe he's a unique individual. I believe he's probably closer to the norm. I had the television view of what a defense attorney is. Would you agree?
Oh, sure, of course. And it's the job of the media to sensationalize to the maximum possible extent, and that case loaned itself to it big time.
It was one of those cases that was so. It seems like it happens every year or so, because unfortunately horrible things happen often.
Yeah.
But there's that one case. My sister-in-law hung on every moment of that case. They live in Southwest Florida.
Yeah.
She hung on every word of that case.
Yes.
When I told her I knew the defense attorney, she was blown away. Like, she wanted me to get an autograph. You know what I mean? She was that enamored by that court case. And that's got to add another level for people with the scrutiny, because the courtroom every day and people standing outside and OJ and some of these others that are just so, blown up out of proportion has got to be tough for the judge.
But, the flip side is, I encourage people to try and not get out of jury duty. The jury system is the one place where you can really get a glimpse of what the legal system is really like. And most jurors leave their jury duty with a much higher degree of respect for the judicial system. And you're chuckling, so perhaps that's not necessarily your experience.
It's funny you say that, because I was chosen for a jury. I've been picked for jury duty a couple of times. I sat on a jury once. And this was in Florida, where I grew up. And it took us longer to choose the jury than it did to try the case. But what happened was the questions of the jurors that each of the lawyers gets to ask, and I don't know the rules, but what you get to dismiss so many, or however it worked. We got to the end of the questioning, and the last thing the judge asked all of us was, is there anything that we did not ask you that you think might be relevant, or something to that? And the woman sitting next to me raised her hand, and the judge said, and she said, the defense attorney was my divorce lawyer. And everybody laughed out loud, and out she went.
Yes.
And I thought, that's how hard they work to get the right jury.
Yes.
It ended up being a DUI case, and we were asked about this woman that was on trial for DUI. We didn't know anything about her other than that case intentionally, and we very quickly convicted her. And all of us were wondering at the time, why would you even go to court? I mean, you were obviously, with all the evidence presented, it was obviously a very quick guilty verdict. We found after in the sentencing phase that this was her third DUI. And that she had nothing to lose. She had nothing to lose. But you're right. There was a respect for the justice system I had no idea for and I say just a DUI case, but in comparison to other major court cases, the lengths they were willing to go to get a jury that they could count on.
Yes,
a fair trial.
That's right. Yeah, it's really a good system. When we look at systems around the world, we really are a shining example. And I recognize that there are some serious issues. Arizona is at the forefront in addressing those issues, in my opinion. But I always, on the first day of class, when I teach constitutional law, I always say, one of the differences in the United States and almost every other country on earth is, if you burn a Chinese flag in China, what's going to happen to you? Mm-hmm. And you will probably never be heard from again. You burn a flag here in the United States, whether you agree or disagree with the First Amendment principle, you can't be prosecuted for that. And a system that has that much respect for the rule of law is a system where I will take my chances any day of the week.
And that's where, specifically about that, I have said that I think desecrating the flag is one of the most horrible things you can do. But I would stand up and defend your right to do it, because that's what it is controversial speech that must be protected.
Exactly.
I hope, I'm never going to say anything that calls the First Amendment into question. You don't have to worry about what I'm going to say on the radio. You may not agree with it, but it's not going to be something that's deemed offensive or deemed questionable. But that's the very stuff we have to protect, because if one group of people... I'm not going to drag you into this, but we have this phrase now, we used hate speech. And if you can deem it hateful, then you can call it dangerous, then you can stop people from saying it. Well, what happens when somebody with the opposite view comes into power?
Absolutely.
And now you've got a completely 180-degree difference in the rules, and what used to be considered safe speech is now called hate speech, and you can no longer say it.
Yes, and that is really true of all of our constitutional principles. When I saw Justice Kavanaugh go through his confirmation hearing, it made me think, oh my gosh, he is not getting due process here. And if he is not getting it because of partisanship, then we don't have a guarantee of due process. Same thing for freedom of religion, et cetera, et cetera. We either all have the rights or none of us do. You're
right. It's why that people ask the question all the time, why even send somebody to trial? Why? And even I have found myself that when there's someone that is so obviously guilty, there's witnesses, there's cameras, there's evidence, and yet they plead not guilty and they go through a trial. It seems like such a waste of the court's time. But if you stick to the basic principle that everyone's entitled to their day in court, adherence to that is far more important than any one case.
I so appreciate your view on that.
But isn't that? But do you?
Yeah, I totally agree.
It is obviously we would hope somebody would stand up and say, yes, I did it. Because the long-term effects of things, whatever they are, I'm going to tell the other story I'm going to tell you is about one of your colleagues. And I hope you'll talk to him about it and get his perspective privately, because it ended up being okay. But the courts being bogged down with nonsense a lot of times make people feel like justice isn't available because the courts are overwhelmed. That's where this story is very. I know we're running out of time. I don't want to keep you too late. I could do this for hours with you.
Same.
We have never had a chance to sit and talk, and I love this.
Likewise.
Years ago, I stopped a shoplifting. Probably not my wisest choice, but I was with my oldest stepdaughter, and we were coming home from a Coyotes game, and we stopped at a convenience store that was the corner store that we went to. I literally was in twice a day, 6 days a week. Knew everybody that worked there. Everybody knew us by name. It was just a corner store. And these two punk kids walked in and just walked up to the liquor and grabbed as much as they could hold, and we're going to walk out with it. And I stopped them and I said, put it back. And it went from 0 to 100 that fast. And I was a lot bigger than this one kid, and the other one was tall and skinny, and they wanted to fight. And he was throwing liquor bottles at me and cursing, and he was going to kill me. And I just backed away. I kept him at bay. And I said, just get out of here. And the one kid kept trying to get behind me. To make a long story longer, I ended up fighting in the parking lot with two guys until the police got there.
Oh, my God.
Now, to be honest, I'm not Rambo. I'm just saying it wasn't much of a fight. I was not in fear for my life. But I never threw a punch. I kept him at bay. I kept him off me. When he attacked me, I took him to the ground. I let him up. They were arrested. He was charged with aggravated assault and shoplifting. Didn't show up in court. And when they finally caught up with him, I got a phone call from the county attorney's office right before I went on the air in my afternoon show at another station. And they told me they weren't going to prosecute because they didn't feel they had a likelihood of conviction. And I said to this young lawyer, I said, there's 4 witnesses and a video, and they refused to prosecute. So I went on the air and I told the story. And at the time, Bill Montgomery was the county attorney. And I knew Mr. Montgomery. I knew Bill fairly well, and I considered him a friend. And I even said on the air, he doesn't know anything about this. This is a decision made in his office. But at the time, I felt like, wait a minute, I did everything right. I didn't throw a punch. I didn't beat this guy up. I didn't inflict street justice. I let the courts handle it, and their courts are letting me down. What ended up happening is it got transferred to the Phoenix City Court. The guy got convicted. He pled guilty to the charges, and it was over. But in that moment, it was, even though I knew the county attorney, I felt as if, how could I not get justice from the justice system?
Yep.
It happens very often because of the time of the court. You know, it had to go to Phoenix City Court and taken away from the county. Had the Phoenix City Court not taken it, do you understand the frustration?
Oh, totally. And just imagine what people in San Francisco and Oakland have felt, these recent years where there's simply a no prosecution policy in place in many instances. You go to a Walgreens in San Francisco, you would be all alone trying to prevent that shoplifting.
But more so, and I wonder, and I've changed my views in what I say about things. We talk about public safety, and we need to fully fund public safety, which I'm an advocate for. But I've also thought about, well, hang on a minute. I knew Mr. Montgomery. I don't think that he was looking to shirk responsibility or not have a policy of not prosecution. But Are we funding the criminal justice system the way we should? Do we have enough lawyers? Do we have enough people that are prosecuting cases? Do we have enough judges that are able to hear the cases? Is that something we need to focus on as much as we talk about funding the police? Do we need to fund the justice system?
So that's a really good question. And, we talk about it. I know that there is a legislator who is trying to seriously cut our budget in the current legislature, and that would have devastating effects. And sometimes politicians get angry at us for a decision we make and punish us by cutting our budget. I have to say, being on the inside of the court system, and I made this point yesterday, we get more volunteer labor than any other organization I've ever seen in my entire life. There are so many citizens serving on our commissions that keep things going. It's a very efficiently run organization. The one area right now where we are really having trouble is funding our probation system. And you have a good probation system when you don't hear about it. Mm-hmm. When you don't hear, this person was out on probation and committed another crime. We are so precarious on that right now because we don't pay our probation officers nearly enough to make their jobs worthwhile, and there are competitors, who are eager to hire them. All in all, I think that I'll probably get in trouble for saying this. All in all, I think our resources are ample, and we have learned how to make the best of limited resources. But that's certainly one area where we could do better.
Well, I appreciate the time. This is such a fun conversation. I say to people, I'm not a college graduate. I never went to college myself. I'm like your dad. I wish I had. I'm working on a college degree. I want to get a college degree now. I wish I were younger because I would have loved to pursue a career like yours. Because I figured out in this job over the years, I love the debate.
Yes,
but for me is debate with no consequences. I would love the opportunity to have the debate where there are consequences. Mm-hmm. So in that regard, I envy the career you have.
Well, it is not too late for you to go to law school, too.
Oh, that just scared the heck out of a lot of people. Thank you so much
Mike,
for the time.
Thank you so much for the honor of joining you for it.
All right, Supreme Court Justice Clint Bolick, and this is why we do these. You learn stories about some of the most important people in Arizona and the background in their stories. Watch all of the episodes at KTAR.FM. You can find it on our YouTube channel or anywhere you download podcasts. Just look for the other episodes of Amazing Arizonans. Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching Amazing Arizonans, presented by Resolution Copper. Tap the button in the middle to subscribe to KTAR News.